to Funnel Reboot, the podcast that shares ideas on how to upgrade your lead generation. Here is your host, Glenn Schmeltzley.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Today's show is on analytics, though we're not talking numbers. We're talking about the people side of things today. First, I want to remind you, I really appreciate any and all feedback or sharing that you do of this podcast. Please use the website. Please use social media. Reach out to me. Leave a call on our listener feedback line, 613-703-7073. I'll play your comments on the show. So to today. Okay, we know that analytics is a thing, but what does it mean to be doing analytics right? It doesn't mean only that a company's analysts churn out accurate numbers. No, it has to do with how a company makes decisions. The data guiding those decisions doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. There's got to be a functional team analyzing it. What's the composition of that team? What kind of processes do they follow? Do outsourced partners get involved? What technology is used? Leaders that don't put enough thought into this can burn through a lot of money and headaches, and their organizations will never become data-driven like they'd hoped. Leaders have to pay attention to this. And to borrow a term from environmentalists, they have to make analytics functions that are sustainable. Our guest thought he grew up to be a geologist. By college, though, he chose to go into information systems, and he came out of college to work at the once mighty Novell. Over the course of several years, Novell shrank and then laid off his group, and he switched to implementing Omniture web analytics for various companies, which showed him both the highs and lows of the consulting firm model. He then went to a brand with a popular web-based business, which caused him to question the value analytics really offered in an organization. And while there, he met coworker Hilla DeHaan, and they started imagining what analytics done right would look like. And in March 2013, they started their own analytics shop, 33 Sticks. There's more to the story of them working together, such as how they came up with that name, but I'm going to let him tell you that. So please give a listen now to my guest who's going to talk about sustainable analytics, Jason Thompson. I'm really glad to welcome Jason Thompson. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, and what we're going to chat about today is the work of analytics. We're going to maybe, pry open the hood here and see some things, maybe some things people don't like to necessarily talk about, but things are really important for helping organizations who have to pay for the privilege of having analytics and data by which they make decisions, how to make that run well, right?
It's an amazing topic, and we're all paying for it in one way or another. If we're using data, there's always a cost. So I think it's a valid conversation for probably every one of your listeners.
Yeah, I was just on that. I was put through an exercise which made it extremely clear to me. And I'm embarrassed to say that before they gave us this exercise, I'd never thought of it. But this was in one of those professional development things where you're sent off site, and it was for people who are doing analysis. And they gave us a little bit of a case study, but it was very high level. And they said, you have to go and find out more to, solve the deep-rooted problems in this case. You have $100. When $100, what am I going to do with $100? But then they started giving us other sheets, and they laid them out, and they said, this is the latest customer survey, and it had a price on it. And they'd bring out another sheet, say, this is the latest web data, and it had another price on it. And it became really quickly apparent that I couldn't get them all because the total was way over 100, but I could get some. And so I envisioned myself kind of walking down the aisles with a shopping cart and picking these, pieces of data up and putting them in my cart one at a time. And there it was. There, the idea of, okay, well, that's what my budget is. And these are the, work initiatives. And these are external agencies that I hire. And there it all is in a really basic construct that everybody gets.
Yeah.
And there's the cost of data.
I love looking at it that way because there is a cost. And I think so many people don't realize it. It may be easy to look at, well, I want package X or I want to work with agency Y. There's an off-the-shelf cost for that. But even below that, there's cost. Just collecting data, adding a new data point, there's a cost. And I think oftentimes we don't think about it. And, I know there's been a movement that's ebbed and flowed over the last 15 years around, do we capture all the datas or do we capture some of the data? And all the data crowd is like, well, there's no real incremental cost for capturing it all. And we might as well have it there. I'm like, but there is. There's always a cost. And to think otherwise, I think puts us in a place where we're putting ourselves in a position where we're going to go data bankrupt before we know it, because there is a cost and we're just choosing not to recognize it.
Yeah. And let's remember that the ideal that this data is being kept around for is changing. Companies for a long time now, you and I are about the same age. We've been out in the workforce for decades now.
Yeah.
And we've heard things like data driven. I even remember, way back with books like In Search of Excellence, right? Oh, you got to go get the data and you've got to have strategic management, make decisions by the numbers. But that's a bit of a moving target. And the places that you go and get the data, when push really comes to shove, the decisions about the people, the processes, and the technology that it needs to pull this off. You may find some organizations where they say that at a high level, but they've starved each of those resources, and so they can't provide it. There are other cases where it's gone way overboard and they're wasting. So what I'd really like us to delve into today is maybe an equilibrium point. And you've got a name for that kind of equilibrium idea of analytics, right?
Well, we talk about sustainability of analytics, and it kind of came about because a lot of the companies that we first started talking to when we started the company, man, we're going to be 9 next month. It's quite the milestone for us.
Awesome.
It doesn't get easier, but
Right.
in the beginning, we kind of heard the same story over and over again that, we're buying all this technology, we're collecting all this data, but it just seems like we're less and less informed. We're struggling more and more to provide the answers. And one of the things that we started to uncover was there was just never any thought into the sustainability of the practice. Again, like, we were byproducts of this consumer culture where it's just more and more and more is always going to be better. And what we found was that simply wasn't the case. When we didn't think about things in a sustainable manner, things started to break down. And it was not a shock to us to see these organizations really struggle to drive value from the data, whether they wanted to be data driven or data informed or whatever the buzzword of the time was. They were frustrated. And we wanted to help solve for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're driven somewhere, whether you have an intended destination or not. And I suppose maybe I'm butchering the metaphor here, but when you take that, give me all the data idea and, pass that down the ranks, sometimes you'll find that, the line staff, they will maybe go a little bit too far. We can't just go that far these days. Companies, under their governance model, are increasingly responsible for the privacy of that information and the lifetime that information is kept around. So you can't just say, give me all of it.
That's right.
That's no longer cool. And you have to factor that in as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we can talk about the costs of storing and processing data, but you hit on a huge one that, if you have any any companies that you work with in Europe, or you're located in Europe, it's right on your front doorstep. But even here in North America, I'm not sure what the landscape looks like in Canada, but in the States, we're starting to see individual states start to develop their own privacy regulations, and keeping up with that is incredibly difficult. And each new data point that you capture just makes that increasingly more difficult and more costly to be able to properly manage that. So again, we can collect more data, but it is not free. There are definite costs for every data point that we capture.
To describe all companies is probably too difficult to do. And so you've come up with a way of trying to describe sustainability based on where a company is at. Tell me a little bit about how you think of a company as it moves through maturity, and what the different issues are that they're going to come up against trying to do this sustainably at each of the stages.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've tried very diligently to do is help our customers progress in their maturity of how they use data. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with different maturity curves. And, we use a crawl, walk, run, fly approach, which I think a lot of people think about, that you have this natural maturity that you go through. But what we found is that every single one of the companies that we work with don't mature in a predictable path that goes from A to B to C.
Right.
It just never happened that way. And so what we wanted to do is help our customers understand where they were, I guess, vertically. So from a foundational level, are we creating sustainable implementation practices? Are we creating data that is actionable and is clean? And then we start to move into, okay, let's talk about what our maturity looks like from a reporting standpoint, and then an analysis, and then an optimization, and then a personalization, and kind of help draw that map so we have some sort of future vision that we're eyeing towards. But also we go, I guess, maybe horizontally, in which we try to help them understand where they're at in each of those different phases. And again, I think one of the things that the companies that we worked with were struggling with is they felt like we were told we're in walk or we're in crawl, and it just doesn't feel natural. And it's right, because as we're maturing, we may be doing things in fly. We may be doing a lot of things in run, but overall, we're still, from a maturity standpoint, maybe still in crawl. And it's important to recognize that, again, we don't move linear, where one stage you graduate and you move on from junior high school to high school, right? It's you're investing and maturing in a lot of different spots all over the place. And our goal is to really help orient them to where they're at and provide them with a map for how they can get there. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this, and from my career, I've been on the client side, I've been on the software services side, I've been on the software side, I've been on pure services side. I've kind of seen all of the different angles. And one of the things that has really frustrated me over the years is that the SaaS companies in the data space are really, really good at creating needs and desires. And a lot of times it's not what the companies need. And so our goal was to help provide them with that map so they could then go and make more informed decisions. Do we need this product? Do we need this service for where we're trying to go next in our journey?
In a clear-headed way.
Yeah.
Not being tainted by all the sales speak.
And it can be very easy to do because there's so much FUD out on the marketplace. And a lot of these sales teams are really, really great at what they do. I mean, they do paint a picture where you get FOMO. It's, I need this. We're missing out if we don't have it. And it's helpful to be grounded in those discussions.
Yeah. And yet, Jason, their case actually has been made stronger by some of the biggest players, the Apples, the Googles of the world.
Yeah.
Here we are, we're recording this in spring of 2022. And over the last 18 months, we've been told our browsers are losing cookies. We've been told we've got to change to a completely new framework for web analytics.
Yeah.
And we've been told that there are other aspects of data that are either not going to persist or that they're going to be rolled together, no longer at an individual basis, just we're going to be given cohorts. So can you really blame the average person who has to, get work done in an analytics discipline for not feeling FUD and FOMO?
Yeah, no, I don't put the blame on them. I put the blame on sales, and the biggest part of my job is sales, and I'm not very good at it. So I empathize with how incredibly hard sales is, and I don't want to come off as saying I'm attacking that role, but that's where I do put a lot of the blame, and that's where a lot of my frustration lies. And I've been in this space since 2004, and I've seen lots of different iterations of the sky is falling, we're losing cookies, or oh, well, now we're losing third-party cookies, or now we can't do this, or now there's a privacy regulation, we can't do that. And every single one of those iterations of what are we going to do has created opportunity for people to use fear tactics to sell software and services.
Right. So, and let's kind of call that out on the sustainability. And I love, that word plays both in an environmental sense too.
Yes.
And, that's kind of what I think about if we take someone who's getting all hyped up about a certain product and they believe that it's going to cure all ills.
Yeah.
They will go through, the case will be made, maybe senior management will grudgingly agree to drop the money on it. They do. Take us through the rest of it. Like, what do you see as being what's going to happen next that you are shuddering about and saying to that person, you are not being sustainable here?
Yeah, I mean, and the reality of it is that I've never seen one of those pitches play out where the customer is satisfied that it solves all their problems. And
what goes off the rails? What ends up being unsustainable?
Yeah, so I think what ends up happening is, well, number one, things are a lot harder than anyone gives it credit for, especially from a sales perspective. It's hard to be honest about the investment I'm going to have to make this happen. And the biggest thing that goes off the rails is investment in people. Software sales, especially in data, wants to make it sound like whether you're doing implementation of data capture or whether you're doing advanced analysis, we can just put our solution in place and it just magically happens. And we just have the AI behind the scenes to make this all magical. And the reality is that puts the client or the customer in a very bad place, because that will go off the rails faster than anything else, because they're going to get into it and they're going to realize either we don't have the expertise, we don't have the number of people that are needed to make this happen.
Right. We didn't set aside the budget.
We didn't put the budget because we were led to believe we didn't need to budget for people to make this happen. We sell the software, we put the ink on the contract, we get a couple months in and we're like, uh-oh, we do need that budget. So now what do? We scramble. And it puts the project off track. And oftentimes it goes sideways from there.
There's a loss of credibility.
Yeah.
Going back to the higher ups saying we goofed.
Yep.
The other issue is that if the data isn't clean, and this is always one with process, that, there's not going to be the level of clarity that people thought they were getting.
That's right.
So
that's right. And that's one of the areas that I'm really passionate about, and that is simplifying. That's one of the pillars I talk about, is simplify it. We, again, in the movement to have more and more and collect everything, we're at a time where the companies that we're working with have more data from a behavioral web mobile app than ever before, but less actionable than ever before. Whether they don't have the people to action that data, but a lot of times it's the health and quality of the data is simply not there. They've overspent on collecting data, and they've underspent on people to sustain and maintain that data to the point it becomes unactionable. And I am squarely in the camp of less is more. I would much rather have less data that is clean and actionable than a database full of dirty data that I can't make sense of. And two, I don't have the budget to hire people to make sense of it.
What do you think needs to happen inside of an organization to make them less dependent or less addicted to grabbing all that data? That's a good word, right? To have the fortitude to say, nope, we're closing the doors here. Everything that's inside the barn stays. The stuff outside, we're not going to worry about. So that not every organization can do that.
Most can, and especially if you're a public organization, it's very hard to do that. So there's a way that I look at the world, and I saw this very early on when I first got into consulting in 2004. One of the questions that I would ask when I got a new client is, "Why are you buying analytics?" And 8, 9 times out of 10, they would say, "I don't know, but our board is demanding it. I don't know, but the CEO says we have to have it." And it was almost an appearance game that we had to have it because we have a quarterly earnings call coming up and we have to say we have analytics. And that moved on to, we have to say we're doing optimization. And that moved on to say we have to be doing predictive analytics. And it's just this never ending cycle of things we have to be doing. And so the way that I look at the world, especially when it comes to data and especially in big companies, is there's two different worlds. One is the reality we live in, and that is our capabilities that we can do today with the data that we have or that we're moving quickly towards.
Yep.
And the other world is this world of appearances. And this is where I think we spend so much money on software, is that we have to give the appearance that we're keeping up. That, now we've moved so far beyond basic data. You're talking about all these terms around BI and data lakes and lake houses and all this complexity. And I'm like, what are we talking about here? We can't even sit down and say, how many unique people came to our site and bought today? We struggle to answer that question. What are we talking about doing all these things? I empathize because we can't just ignore it, because we have to keep up the appearances that we're at a level that we're not at. My fear is, though, that we put so much energy into that it actually ends up destroying the capabilities that we do have. So how do we solve it? I don't know, because it's not a simple conversation to go to the CEO and say, you know what, I know we spent all this money and have all this fancy software, but I think we should simplify and just answer a few basic questions and then go from there. I don't know that that's going to go over too well.
No, but that's better than the conversation where you say we over-indexed for appearances and bulking up, and we've actually screwed up the real fundamentals.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, though, that at least from a personal standpoint, there's not a lot of accountability for that. And the reason I say that is because, speaking of people, there's such a demand for analytics professionals that your ability to move between companies is so incredibly easy that it's like, mess that up. I'm not going to be accountable for fixing it. I'll just bounce and go to another company. In fact, we've seen companies that people have been so addicted to instrumentation that they've ran through 3 or 4 people that come in, say, you know what, the guy that did it before me,
rip and replace.
I'm going to rip it out. There was horrible. I'm going to put it in. They milk that for 12 to 18 months. Now they've reached some kind of limit. And it's like, you know what? I'm done with that. I'm going to go do that in another company. And it's just this cyclical process. It's like, no wonder we're struggling to move forward from a maturity standpoint. We're tearing it to the ground and rebuilding it every 18 months.
And we are now 4 generations into that. And it turns out that we're back at the first package we started with.
That's right. and so, part of it is this ease of movement of people between companies that allows that to happen. And part of it, I think, is that we haven't been pushed as an industry to really up our individual skills. And that's always been a worry to me, and that there's always been work that we can be comfortable with. And whether I can reinvent that at the company I'm in, or I can bounce and go to another company and do it, that anytime we start to feel a bit uneasy about, okay, I'm really, really good at, say, implementation, but now what? It's like, it's kind of scary to move to the next thing. So I'm going to go somewhere else and re-implement. And so I think that's kind of helped keep us in that cycle as well.
So let's, as we're talking about the sins of analytics people, I guess the one on the skill side that, and I don't know if we're going to, solve all the problems today, Jason, but, one of the things that I think tips people off that a person is sandbagging on those skills is when they start to condescend and speak in patronizing tones to their peers. Marketing analysts sometimes are guilty of this. And, when they're asked a basic question about how some data could be aligned and reported on, they say, well, there's a whole lot of factors and you wouldn't understand it. And to me, like if I kind of put it into, let's say, a cinematic universe, they're kind of describing themselves as Superman, where they just have these powers with no explained origin for them. They're there, and you can't be Superman. So how dare you question Superman? I do not mind if somebody says, okay, it's going to take me half an hour to explain what this is, but I did go through the skills. That to me makes them look more like Iron Man, where, okay, he can do fantastic things too, but he built it all. And like, if you break it all down, you could understand in basic engineering what he did. Right.
Yeah. And I will tell you from a services perspective, when we run into those situations, it can be incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, I've seen that multiple times over the years where we've gone into a company, they have a Superman there, and one of three things happen. One, they see us as a very strong ally that we can make them even more successful and more of a superhero. To me, those are awesome when that happens.
Okay.
But more often than not, one of two things happens. They become incredibly defensive because we're seen as a threat.
Of course.
And they either end up leaving the company because they sold the company something they couldn't deliver and it was about to be exposed. And not that I would ever go in and do that. When we go into companies and find resources that are a bit over their head, we are incredibly empathetic and want to help bring them up to the level they're at and let them have all the credit. But I also understand how they would feel incredibly scared. And as a defense mechanism, get, very defensive. And sometimes they leave and sometimes we get fired. Sometimes we get absolutely destroyed and thrown under the bus because if I can't get them out, they're going to expose me and it's going to, ruin this little game that I'm playing. So I don't know how we solve that, but one has to be on the personal side of those in analytics where we have to be comfortable saying we don't know all the answers. We don't have all the experience. We're always learning and growing, and that shouldn't be a weakness. That should be a strength, and we should be able to admit what we don't know so that we can grow. And I have a side story about that. I don't need to go into it, but maybe I will because I think it's a good example.
Okay.
My first job out of college, I worked in IT doing software development.
Yep.
And I had a guy on my team that we were the same age and he knew everything. And even when he didn't and would ask for help and someone would help them, he's like, I was having a brain fart. Like I knew that. I just, for some reason forgot it. And he had convinced himself of that lie so well that he had lost all motivation to learn. Because in his mind, he already knew it.
Yeah.
So, that's dangerous. I also think we have an opportunity on the business side to address it as well, in that one of the biggest problems is that businesses don't know how to hire for analytics related roles. They hear a few buzzwords and think, okay, this person is qualified, but they really, really struggle to understand, am I hiring the right person for this role? And they just don't have the background and experience to be able to see through whether they're getting BS'd or not.
I can imagine, if you look across even the roles that you have done in your past, I would imagine that, when you went through for a technical interview as a developer, there was a well-established set of questions put to you, and that the measurements on those answers at least gave the people doing it a sense of whether or not you were BSing them or not. I know that in marketing, there are some well-worn, archetypes and decision tree questions for sussing out if a marketer really knows what they're saying. I don't know that there's one of those for analysts.
I don't think there is. I think that is missing. And one, there's not that set of questioning, but two, who's the person internally that has the experience to be able to ask those questions, I think is also a problem. But you're right. As a funny aside, I once interviewed at Adobe for a product manager position. And one of the interviews was with one of the lead developers. and he asked me a question. I can't even remember what he asked me. And I'm like, dude, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he's like, can I tell you that you're the first one so far that said that? He's like, I completely made that up. That is gobbledygook. And everyone else tried to, give me an answer. And you're the first one that said, I have no clue what you're asking.
Right. But they would rather squirm and
Yeah.
not admit that they don't know.
And that's unfortunate because, again, I think admitting what we don't know is a real strength. But we've been led to believe that we need to have all the answers all the time, even though we know logically that's impossible.
It's very true. And in analytics, it is laid bare, right? I mean, you have to be clear about that. And I think about if you went to a meeting and tried to pretend as if you did know everything, every subsequent meeting at your company is going to go badly. In fact, the number of meetings that you have those days are numbered.
Yeah.
Right. So that's it is a muscle that needs to be trained, and to say to people, I think it could actually broach a new conversation. No, we don't have any information about that. Is this a one-off, or is this something that we need to build the capability for? Could I come back to you with a proposal for how we would, internalize this capability?
Yeah, I had a CEO once that said something to me like, the greatest analyst that I've ever worked with loved the phrase, I don't know. And he said, oftentimes I would ask them, a question, they would say, I don't know, but let me go research what options we have.
Yeah.
Let me go dive into the data and see if we can answer this question, but I don't know, and that's right. Like, as analysts, we should not know a lot of things, but have that drive and insane curiosity to go see if we can figure it out.
Absolutely. In terms of organizations that you see that do it well, before we leave them and come to our, last crew that, really have a problem with sustainability, but in organizations that are doing it well, are there any metrics, or do you just see a certain structure where they're given some freedom, but there is also oversight? Like, what looks to you like a sustainable organization when you're looking at them going, yeah, these guys have it together?
I think the number one thing is executive level leadership. It's the thing that we see missing in lots of organizations that are struggling with it, where at least in the digital analytics space, a lot of the leadership is down at the director level. Maybe it rolls up to a VP of marketing, but then it ends there.
Okay.
And there's a lot of infighting that creates. There's a lot of lack of collaboration. And analytics is a highly collaborative role. It touches so many different areas, or it should touch so many different areas of the business. And oftentimes it doesn't. And I think a big part of that comes down to lack of executive level leadership. So I think that is critical. I think getting buy-in, whether you have a broad team or not, at least getting buy-in and creating kind of dotted lines to other areas of the organization, whether it's your engineering team, whether it's your marketing team, whether it's your customer experience team or design team, like all of these things play into analytics.
Yep.
And so companies that have thought about how to structure that either formally or informally, where these teams work together, is a huge predictor of success. And I would say the final thing is, where in the process of creating customer experiences is analytics thought about? In lots of companies, it's an afterthought. It's wait a minute, this isn't working right. Let's get some analytics in place to go figure this out. The companies that are operating at incredibly high levels have the analytics component embedded in the product management component of their company, where analytics is helping inform, just as someone from UX or someone from design would help inform
at the time they build it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or as the website's being built, or as
Absolutely.
any part of the experience is. Don't leave it, but put it up front. Yep, that's a really good way to look at it. Okay, so I said we were going to come around to probably the chief perpetrators of unsustainability, and we might as well, let's look at those outsourced vendors that have been around for a good long time, that build themselves either as general management consulting shops, or maybe they're specialized in an analytics practice. Oh, and I guess most importantly, they got their business model from the world of accounting firms and management consulting firms, right? So, what do you think about how they practice analytics on behalf of clients, and what's unsustainable about that?
I hate it. That was one of the driving factors into starting 33 Sticks was I was in that world. I never worked for a big five consultancy, but I worked in 3 or 4 different consultancies before I decided to start my own agency. And I hated every bit about how we practice that. I hated how we build.
Yep.
You know, we build by the hour, which
Yep.
if you build by the hour, it needs to take long, because if you do it short, you're leaving money on the table. So,
Yeah.
but from a client perspective, the faster I can solve your problem, as long as I'm not reducing the quality of our work, the better for you. You want a solution now, not 6 months from now. But as an agency,
as an
I need
agency,
it 6
that's
months from now, because that's where I'm going to get the most utilization and billing. And so there's the fundamental disconnect between what's good for the consulting firm and what's good for the client just did not sit well with me.
So there's this misalignment, and a lot of the symptoms of this, or the places where you see the trail, from the scene of the crime, is you see it in things that are on an invoice that just look like busyness, right? You see maybe meetings where instead of just having the day-to-day person whose time is logged against that meeting, there were 2 senior people, that were also in on the meeting that didn't say boo, but showed up for the meeting, and lo and behold, that you're invoiced for them as well.
I've had
at a higher rate.
I've had to field that call before in the past, and it's very uncomfortable. But I mean, I've answered that phone call where the client said, "Wait a minute, I got your bill. Why was I billed for 6 hours for this 1 hour meeting?" And I'm like, "Well, we had this person." I'm like, "Well, they didn't really do anything." And I'm like, "Well, but they were there in case we needed them." And it's very
Icky.
very icky and uncomfortable and sometimes unethical. And as a consultant, I empathize with the individual contributor that's a consultant, because a lot of times it's not their call. A lot of times they are put in situations where they're being asked to make borderline ethical decisions because it's what's needed for the company to hit their performance metrics in order to be profitable. And I've seen it far too often. I've talked to far too many consultants who said, "I'm just burned out doing this because I just got to the point where I was put in a situation where I either had to do what didn't feel right to me, or if I didn't, I was going to get yelled at, and I'm just tired of getting yelled at."
Yeah. So I think it comes back to this notion of what is knowable, and just hear me out on this. But my theory is, because people aren't evil from the get-go, but I think this is kind of how we end up in this fix.
Yeah.
If we all realize that a analytics function, whether it's half internal and half outsourced, that function, there is a boundary to what they know. Outside of that boundary lies ignorance.
Yes.
But the point of pushing out that boundary, there's a diminishing return, right? A company doesn't have unlimited budget. We're not university think tanks, so we have to come down to an answer at some point. And we also have to go to our leadership and say, well, for that next answer, it's 10 times more cost for 1 time more, increment of, additional territory we gain. And they'll tell you, they'll say, okay, well, no, stop it there. But in a outsourced world where they're based off how utilized they are, they will go through their internal list of problems to check for, and they won't stop at that boundary. They'll stop when they've hit their billing quota.
Yeah, and they may not even stop then. And that if there's any hint from the client that there's something else that's needed, even if it's outside their sphere of expertise,
chuck that into.
Because if you don't know who you are, if you don't have an identity as a services firm, it's really hard to say we'll do anything that you throw at us. And that is completely unfair to customers. And especially if you start to build any kind of trust with them to say, yeah, we'll do it. And it's something that I'm really is really, really meaningful to me, is to be probably to the far extreme blunt on what we do really well and what we don't. And I think I mentioned before we started recording, if a McKinsey or a management consultancy firm came in and pulled back the covers on our business, they'd probably say, you're a horrible CEO and you're doing it all wrong. And they're probably right, because I'm confident we could be making 5-6x the revenue we're making right now, but I would have to put my principles and ethics on the back burner in order to do that. And just for me, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. So I think the boundary of sustainability, probably is defined by when the outsourced person says either, yes, we'll plow ahead and, throw cannon fodder and everything to get you that answer, versus saying, I don't think you really need that answer.
Yeah. And the beauty of that approach, and again, it's hard to do that, especially if you're an individual contributor. It's not your company. You haven't been given autonomy or support to have those conversations. I get that it's incredibly difficult, but the paradox of it is that when you do that, you earn more trust, which typically results in more business. Yeah. And so while you may be saying no to something now, it's a high likelihood that you're unlocking a yes in the future to something else.
Yeah, well, and we haven't really gotten into it, but this does boil down to you as a person and your co-founder who have a particular philosophy that you espouse. And I'm going to borrow something that you said on a podcast, and I'm paraphrasing here, but back to that kind of individual contributor. And you said, describing yourself about 9-10 years ago, you said, well, I want to be an active owner in a company, and I don't want to be in a company where that's, revenue is the only thing. And you said it was frustrating to me, as an employee, and it's why you started 33 Sticks. You said, I wanted to see with making a company, if it's possible to do analytics differently. Yeah. And if not, then I'd have my answer and I'd know it's not possible. But, I would leave the whole services industry because I would know that it's horribly broken.
That's right. And I still struggle with that every day. And I have, friends that I call up and I whine and complain to, or I say, why am I doing this? I picked a known difficult road because it's not easy. And no one, I'm not saying any of the models are easy, but this has been incredibly difficult.
And so 33 Sticks in particular, like just to start with.
Yeah.
Am I fair in characterizing some of it as flat rate?
100%.
Right. So, and you stick to your guns about that.
Yeah.
And
it means I have to turn away business because of that.
You are, or you are saying in scope and, out of scope. And, that takes some discipline
It does.
To do as well. When it comes to the name of 33 Sticks, just go ahead and give us the lowdown on how that came about.
So when we decided to form a company, I had a list of really great corporate-y sounding names. And I ran them past my co-founder. I said, okay, I'm really excited about these. And I listed them out, and she's just like, shaking her head. She's like, what is this? And I'm like, what are these? I'm really proud of these. She's like, this isn't us. This isn't us. In fact, this is the opposite of why we want to do this. We want to do something that's fundamentally changing how services is done. Why would we pick a name that is like everyone else?
And just to set the context, your co-founder and you worked at the same company, but in different locations.
Yeah. So we had a tradition. So I worked for a company in Utah, in the Salt Lake City area. She worked for a company in Los Angeles. Same company. And we had an inter-office mail that went back and forth once a week. And so you can drop stuff in the pouch. It shows up at the other office. And we started this tradition of creating these memory jars that we set on our desk, and just a mason jar with popsicle sticks in it. And then anytime we had like a random thought or a memory or something funny happened in the office, we would jot a little note down on the stick and keep that in our memory jar. And every few weeks or so, I would grab a few sticks out of mine, send it to her, and she would send some of her to me. So in my memory jar, I have a mix of my memories and her memories. And fast forward to naming the company, she said, I hate all the names you came up with. She's like, how many sticks do you have in your memory jar? And I said, I don't know. I have something like 33 sticks. She's like, oh, that's it. That's the name.
And so. It's as far as the other things that you talk about, whether it's through your podcast or elsewhere, the thing that kind of wraps it together for me is simplicity, sustainability. Like you said, you may not consider yourself the, highest CEO wizard of all, but, you've got employees that are happy. You've got clients that are happy, right? Things are kind of sane and well-rounded. And man, that can be refreshing in an era where we think everything has to be over-caffeinated and, hustle all the time.
Yeah. And to me, that's the most important thing for me. And I think where I found my comfort is, even if we didn't have any employees, even if we had one employee, if I was able to build a business that changed that person's life, I would feel so much better about it than if I had a company of 100 people that I was just continuing to do it the way that made me feel burnt out and horrible about my job. Maybe I'm taking more money home. Maybe I'm putting more money in the bank. Maybe I have a beach house in San Diego, but I wouldn't feel good about myself. So I've had to become comfortable with, maybe not being the CEO that's on the magazine covers and not, getting paid hundreds of millions of dollars in stock options, but I'm content.
Yeah, and I'd extend it to, let's say you're out at the Little League game and one of your clients is there that, you can look across at them and wave, and if you're both lined up at the hot dog stand, they're saying that information you gave us that time, that was really helpful, right? Like that's a purpose.
For sure. And for me, it transcends the work that it goes to the relationship, I'm proud of what we produce. Ultimately, I want to be able to run into someone we've worked with and on a personal level have them say, I am so glad we crossed paths. You made me think about work differently, or you just made it fun, or you were an escape from a really toxic environment that I was in. To me, that is very meaningful.
Well, one of the things about data, which is just hilarious to me, is that it has, depending on how it's used, a value that is practically negative because it costs something to keep, to a value that is almost limitless, where, if a light bulb moment goes, you can have a brand new business line, or heck, even a brand new company. The amount of extensible value of data is really something else. And we said right at the beginning, data has a cost.
Yeah.
And if we can somehow just make the cost and the value fit together and make sure that they're reflected, then that's an ecosystem. And that is, good for people to earn their livelihood on. And it's good for people to, translate into business values. Like, it all works around, but you have to start with that premise of saying, I want to do this right. I don't just want to, run full speed, in every direction all at once. That's not how to do it.
Yeah. And I think I would love to see us get to a point, and if there's just a few dots out there on the landscape that are showing people that this can be done, that we can do things on a much smaller scale in a more simplistic way that have very real meaning and impact. But in order to do that, we have to give up this need or desire to be involved in the theater of data.
Yeah, I love that. And maybe, if we look at folks like Tesla, who've disrupted the gas emission, and gas combustion industry, maybe there is hope. Maybe there can be analytics shops that show the old guard how a new model is needed to make things work. And there are companies out there that are proving it.
Yeah, and I have a lot of respect for those companies, knowing what they're doing on that scale is so much more difficult and complicated
Oh, to be sure.
than what
Yeah.
what we're trying to do. But yeah, it's very refreshing to see it happen, and knowing that it's difficult, but it can be done and it should be done. Tesla is a great example of that. Not only disrupting the way that the vehicles operate, but their entire process of how you buy a car from them and how you're sold to. And
Right.
it's fundamentally a different process. And that's hard when you're in an industry where there's a set way of how we do things. It's hard because consumers need to be educated that there's a different way. It's hard because the rest of your marketplace and competitors is pushing back against it because change is scary and hard. But sometimes we need to get there. And I hope that we can play a small role in helping people think differently about data, think differently about consulting, and think differently about work. And really, that's kind of our mission and why we exist, is we think there's better ways to do things.
And I would say that you emblemize that with every post and every talk that you give, Jason. If people want to find out more about you or 33 Sticks, where can they go?
So they can go to 33sticks.com. We've got a simple website that kind of lays out our philosophy and how we work. If you want to interact with me, I try to be highly available on social media. The easiest place to find me is on Twitter. I'm USU Jason on Twitter. You can also track me down on LinkedIn, but I love to connect with people. I think the biggest part of my job is connecting and talking with people. And so track me down on social. I love to have these types of conversations.
You do. And thanks again for having this one.
No, thank you for inviting me. This has been amazing.
Listener, if you like what you heard today, if this was a refreshing take on analytics, or maybe it demystified a little bit of it for you, go ahead and share it with somebody else who needs to hear it, or start to do something today to change how it's being done, how the incumbent practices may need to wash away, how those reports that you do that maybe nobody looks at, maybe they need to be retired, and you need to have a new look at this that's sustainable. And I hope that you came away with something that makes your funnel even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.